All right, check the mic. We're live for the first time post tampering legally. So Drew Dalman, the former Atlanta Falcons center, thought by most to be the top center in the free agent market. He's going to the Chicago Bears, Sam, which means in the past week, the Bears have a completely different interior offensive line. They've traded for Jonah Jackson from the Rams. They've traded for Joe Thuney from the Chiefs, and now adding Drew Dalman. This was a long rumored move that the Bears would also be going for the top center and completely reshaping 60% of their offensive line so far this offseason.
Yeah, wild. Like 3/5 of the offensive line fixed in 48, 72 hours, whatever it is.
Officially Wednesday. It'll all go through on Wednesday. It'll all be within minutes. So
yes, within the same minute. This is just fascinating, right? Like Ben Johnson has had one of the best offenses in football in the last few years with the Detroit Lions. The Lions have had a top 2 offensive line basically since he's been there. It's been them and the Eagles in some kind of order, right up there at the top of the best offensive lines in the NFL. And one of the questions was, what does that look like if you remove a really good offensive line from this system? Does it still function? Does it still cook the same way? Evidently, Ben Johnson has no interest in finding that out. Now, the upgrades haven't made this the best offensive line in the NFL, but it's a serious sort of indication, like it's a statement of intent that Ben Johnson does not want to find out whether this offense still functions with a bad offensive line, or like how important he believes the offensive line is to the basis of this whole system.
I'm going to bring some data to the table here, Sam. Nice. Do not shoot the messenger because, look, it's our former employer. It's PFF. I'm just going to read some information, and you could do what you want with it, Bears fans and anyone else. Watched a lot of JT O'Sullivan the last couple of years breaking down the Bears. In last year in particular, you have a guy like center Coleman Shelton. He was the center for the Bears. I know JT wasn't a big Coleman Shelton fan. Thought he, had some issues in pass protection. I also found a little bit of a disconnect between what it felt like the Bears were allowing from a pressure perspective for Caleb Williams versus maybe where the PFF grading had ended up. But I just want to read out some numbers and, again, do what you want with them. But last year, Coleman Shelton had a 68.4 PFF pass blocking grade. Tevin Jenkins only played 738 snaps, dealt with some injuries. He was at 75.8. And Matt Pryor had a 78.1. Like, some of the guys that were playing for the Bears did not have poor PFF pass blocking grades. And I'm not going to say this is either right or wrong, but overall, I generally trust the PFF grading in the process. But it definitely felt like it was worse, right? Felt worse than that. And then the other argument that I'll make on the other side is the guys coming in, Jonah Jackson over his last 3 years and Drew Dalman over his last 3 years, when we've seen them over 2,000 snaps each, they're in the 50s. In PFF pass blocking grade, Drew Dalman and Jonah Jackson. Now, Joe Thuney, maybe the best pass blocking guard in the entire NFL. He's at 87. I believe in Joe Thuney, and that grade's brought down a little bit by some play at left tackle. Joe Thuney's outstanding. But I will say, from a pure pass protection standpoint, based off at least one source, Drew Dalman and Jonah Jackson. I'm not saying it's a downgrade. I'm just saying it's not as slam dunk as it feels based off of what those guys are getting paid.
Yeah, Jonah Jackson in particular, I think there's debate as to how impactful a move that is. Number one, he's had a fairly significant injury history. He wasn't the same player coming back off that injury. He does have, previous connection with Ben Johnson, right? He was in Detroit before he was in Los Angeles. So it's not like he's unaware of what he's bringing in with Jonah Jackson. But Jackson has never had a particularly above average PFF pass blocking grade in any given season. He's been good in run blocking in certain seasons, but I think there's definitely an argument that that's not a massive upgrade in any way, shape, or form. One thing that's interesting though, with that disconnect of, the PFF grading versus what it felt like watching the Bears offense, I think there's a few things that work there. Number one, Caleb Williams is a factor in that. Like Caleb Williams holding onto the ball as long as he did, the way he plays the game, that's not an easy assignment in terms of offensive lines and what that's going to result in. Number two, remember, like one of the themes of last season was how many offenses in the NFL were just, it felt like they were overwhelmed by these defensive pass rushes, right? Stunts, creeper pressures, simulated pressures, like all these sort of looks that were just breaking pass protection rules for offenses. So I think you've got that working at the same time as Caleb Williams making an impact on it. And then the third element here is Ben Johnson is coming from an offense that didn't seem to struggle with that too much. Now, how much that was, he had a great offensive line, but I do wonder if, number one, Ben Johnson can work some magic with Caleb Williams and kind of improve that part of the equation. Number two, is his system or is his coaching like inherently better at dealing with this stuff that's currently sweeping the league than everybody else or most other people? And then number three, how much did they actually upgrade from a personnel standpoint? So, I think the Bears are going to be attacking this from multiple different angles, but the most obvious one is clearly they're going at it with a personnel point of view as well.
Yeah, I think those are all fair points. And again, I was just trying to bring some data to the table and kind of let you interpret it as you go. Dalman's also been one of the better run blocking centers in the league over the last few years, and we do know how much Ben Johnson does want to run the ball. I also believe Coleman Shelton struggled in that area, and I thought the Bears generally just struggled to move defensive lines off the ball. And the point that you make about sim pressures and stunts and twists, some of that may not get captured in a player grade, right? And it's not going to always show up, especially if it's a blown assignment or if there's any sort of questions. And that's why sometimes you just have to look at the feel and the totality of things. And I think the Bears, like when they lost quickly and they lost ugly up front. And sometimes maybe it wasn't all properly being assigned to individuals, but as a whole, it didn't feel great. So I get the moves. I understand the moves from the Bears perspective, and I love the aggressiveness in those moves. We sit here and we play GM every year for all 32 teams, Sam, and for teams like the Bears who had offensive line questions, or say the Patriots who have to fix their offensive line. A couple of years ago, the Chargers who had a bad offensive line for Justin Herbert. It's easy for us to just say, well, sign this guy and sign this guy and sign this guy. It doesn't always work out that way, but the Bears are really doing it. They're trading for two guards and signing the top center on the board in Drew Dalman. So credit them for making the aggressive move, putting the pieces in place, or at least attempting to put the pieces in place for Caleb Williams. And they're still nice on the outside as far as tackle goes with Darnell Wright at right tackle, with Braxton Jones at left tackle. And as Daniel in the chat says, they are taking our advice, creeping back towards average. And they have a chance to be above average, right? Again, with Tooney, what Dalman is capable of. We'll see what happens with Jonah Jackson's injuries. This has a chance to go from below average to perhaps an above average offensive line.
Yeah, I mean, the Tooney move is kind of, it's almost an individual move on its own. But this feels a little bit like, remember when the Bengals a few years ago completely revamped their offensive line in an offseason, and they did it with the sort of middle tier, like the middle class offensive linemen. Like they went quickly and signed sort of 3 starters that were middle tier offensive linemen, that weren't the guys that were going to completely shatter the earth, but were going to clearly upgrade what they had without investing crazy money into it. I mean, Dalman's money, according to Diana Rossini, 3-year, $42 million deal with $28 million guaranteed. Like that's not huge, right? That's not like bank breaking. Even, so even if you're looking at this and saying, yeah, it's not necessarily the greatest upgrade in the world, they're not paying him like the greatest upgrade in the world. I think it's a modest but clear statement of intent.
I'd like to apologize to our listeners and viewers right now because you misspelled Drew Dalman's name and then led everyone astray.
I did do that.
It's A-N. You led everyone astray with your misspelling, and then they misspelled the title. We're fixing it though. We're on it right now. So yeah, I'm interested in what this looks like for the Bears and the story of the offseason. You're going to hear everyone else, Sam. If you put on NFL Network right now, their free agent frenzy. If you're watching us, we're all going to say, the Eagles did it. Win in the trenches. You got to start in the trenches. It's like the buzz term of the offseason, even though it's been an axiom in football for 100 years. Win in the trenches. The Bears are the first team this offseason to do that aggressively and say, we're not allowing this to happen again. One other thing I want to add to this from a Bears perspective, we just did Mock Draft Monday this morning and debated the Bears sitting there at pick number 10. I think we eventually gave them Ashton Genty, or you gave them Ashton Genty. They have been linked to all of the tackle guard conversions, and Kelvin Banks has been a common mock draft pick for them, and maybe Genty is a pick for them now that they have this really good run blocking offensive line. They may have passed that threshold that you talk about, Sam, where if you have the pieces up front from a run blocking perspective, then you can add the running back. But I think it's going to be an interesting decision for the Bears to go running back, maybe. But maybe more importantly is going back to the defensive line and leaning into this defensive line class, where I still don't think they've fully gotten that defensive line where it needs to be to compete. They've gotten a lot of other pieces in a much better spot since Ryan Poles took over, but maybe not that defensive line now that I don't think, have to force an offensive line draft pick at 10.
Well, they don't have to force it, but equally, if this is how seriously Ben Johnson treats the offensive line, like they're not out of the market either. Like you've got Braxton Jones at left tackle, who I think is pretty good, but not necessarily a star, and is a year away from his contract needing to be done. Like if they look at this a year in advance and say, is Braxton Jones going to be here in 2026 and beyond, right? And if the answer to that is no, immediately you're not out of the left tackle market at number 10 overall. Joe Thuney, who you just traded for and are going to re-sign, like he's 32 years old. Like that's not necessarily a long-term fix either. So it's a great, I think, short-term attack for this offensive line to completely overhaul it, to get it in a space that you think is going to be really good in 2025, let you work on Caleb Williams and get him where he needs to be. And yeah, I think you're right. It definitely gives you the flexibility to use that number 10 overall pick and go running back, defensive line, wherever you think the value is in the draft. But I don't think it necessarily takes you out of that offensive line marketplace either. And if you think that the offensive line is the foundation of everything this offense is going to be, you can still bring in a Will Campbell if he slides to 10, or a Kelvin Banks if you think he's the guy, or Membu from Missouri if you think he's the best offensive lineman available there either. So I think it just opens up options for the Bears.
All right, man. To me, this is one of the first big dominoes. Not that it's a Drew Dalman, it's the totality of what the Bears have done on the interior of the offensive line. I think they're feeling pretty good about that going forward. Some other moves have already come out, but we're going to keep you updated on all the big ones here on Check the Mic. Make sure you hit the subscribe button, hit the thumbs up on the way out, and stick with us all week as we keep you updated here during free agency.